Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for a bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. With me today is my regular co-host, Cleveland area attorney and Republican factotum, Jay Carson.
Hey, Mike.
Hey, Jay, how are you doing today?
I'm good. I'm better than last time.
Well, that's good. I'm doing well myself, and we obviously have a lot to talk about today. It's been a very busy week, but before we get to our first story, I have a correction to issue. Back in Politics Guys episode 143, and this is the show I did a few weeks ago with Susan Simpson from the 45th, and then actually in the show you and I, Jay, did that aired a few days later, I referred to a VA medical system that had serious problems with quality and wait times compared to the private sector. At least that was my claim. That was sort of, I thought, the conventional wisdom. Well, listener Brian K. tweeted to me that the data didn't actually support that view. And he actually was generous enough to do some research and send along some links that supported his argument, which was great. Thank you, Brian. And I looked them over, or I did some additional digging, and I actually came to the same conclusion that Brian did. I was wrong, and he was right on this. Based on the data I saw, VA quality and wait times aren't actually worse than those in the private sector on average. So I wanted to thank you, Brian, for pointing that out. And I always hate it when people do corrections. They kind of bury them at the end of a show or some little area. And so I wanted to make this our first thing. Also, Brian suggested that a look at the VA might make for an excellent Politics Guys special episode, and I think that's an interesting idea. And in our copious free time, maybe we can put that together. But maybe sometime this summer that would be something that would be worth doing.
All right, thanks for setting it straight, Brian.
All right, so last week President Trump said he planned to pull U.S. troops out of Syria. This week, President Trump authorized the U.S. to take the lead in a joint missile attack with allies Great Britain and France on Syria's chemical weapons infrastructure in retaliation for an alleged chemical weapon attack by Syrian government forces on anti-government rebels in the city of Douma. And the attack, again, this is kind of just coming in basically as we record the show, but hit, I believe, 3 sites that were part of the Syrian chemical weapons infrastructure. And again, this was in response to Assad's attack on his own people, these rebels that left 40 dead and hundreds or more actually suffering symptoms of chemical agent exposure. And of course, both Syria and Russia, its key ally, denied any responsibility. And not only that, but they questioned whether there was any chemical attack at all and said that, well, in any event, the only ones with chemical weapons there are the rebel forces. And now in the wake of the U.S., Great Britain, and France response, Russia's calling for a meeting of the UN Security Council. Then Israel, of course, got involved as well earlier in the week. They're very concerned with growing influence of Iran, which is another Syrian ally in the region. They responded with an airstrike of their own on Iranian assets in Syria, which reportedly left 14 people dead. And while all this is going on, there was a team of inspectors from the International Organization for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons. They are still headed toward I believe, are in Syria at this point. And there was some talk that maybe the U.S. and allied forces would wait to get their report before launching an attack, but clearly that hasn't happened. But apparently they're still looking to go in and try to see what exactly happened. So that's, I think, the situation as we know it right now as of Saturday morning. So, Jay, there's a lot to discuss here. And, I'm particularly interested in knowing if you think, number one, that President Trump's earlier statement about pulling out may have emboldened Assad to launch this attack, and some people are claiming that, and also whether the strike was the right move.
As far as the statements emboldening Assad, I think that's a possibility. And I think that's obviously that's a concern that the conservatives voiced rightfully during the Obama administration when he drew the red line and then didn't follow up on it. And also when we withdrew troops from Iraq and with the, hey, we're withdrawing and sort of giving notice to the other side that you can commence operations now. So I think that's not an unreasonable conclusion to draw. That Trump's statements on that embolden him. It's it's impossible to tell because I'm sure there's a lot of other things that go into Assad's calculations in terms of just what the situation is on the ground and his own tactical stuff and the Russians and all that. But no, I wouldn't. Let's put it this way: I wouldn't disagree with someone who said that Trump's sort of rash statements, which is a problem, because this is sort of exactly the thing Trump said he wasn't going to do.
And didn't he? Yeah, during the campaign, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I seem to recall Donald Trump saying, it's stupid to telegraph our intentions to the enemy. Yet he went ahead and did that. So I don't. Yeah, I don't.
And know. But then I mean, to some extent, if you want to credit him for the the do-over, and he then said we're going to launch a missile attack on Syria. At which point, then people criticized him for, there you go, giving away the plan again. At which he backtracked and said, "Well, I'm not saying we're going to launch one or not, or when it's going to happen." And then he went and launched one. So I mean, sort of, I guess he ends up in the same place at the end of the day. Look, as far as the military strike goes, and we always get lots of anger and stuff anytime we support any kind of military strike, but I'm going to go ahead and support it. This is, if we want to have a system that honors international law and human rights, and the idea that these weapons are simply beyond the pale, then this is what we have to do. And I think it's good we're doing it with allies. This is not a go it alone. And if you look at the people who are upset by it, it's very much the Russians. So again, I think that belies the Trump is a Russian pawn argument. I think what's going to be important is the follow up. If we continue to degrade the chemical weapon capability, and again, I have no idea, what kind of capabilities there are, where they are, how much is needed to degrade it, what other steps we need to do to take down, say, Air Force, that sort of thing. Because look, the fact of the matter is, we'll blow stuff up. The Russians and the Iranians will rebuild it. We need to show that there's going to be a commitment to continually keep that capability downgraded. So that remains to be seen. But look, I think standing up for a principle that you announced and saying this will not stand, I think that's healthy foreign policy. And again, particularly when what we're talking about is a regime that is attacking its own citizens and civilians with chemical weapons.
Yeah, I agree. As a general rule, I don't think we should get involved in civil wars, but we can't allow the normalization of chemical weapons use. That's just beyond the pale. And so I think it seems to me, based on what we know, the right and appropriate response. But I will say, and this is something that troubles me, and it even troubled me during the Obama administration, is I don't think that it's not that the Constitution necessarily matters to a lot of people, but I don't think this was constitutionally okay. My read, and the read of a number of legal experts, is that the president actually doesn't have the constitutional authority to launch strikes like this. Also, like the strike that President Obama launched in Libya, and there are a couple others.
The strikes that Clinton launched in Serbia. The strikes that Reagan launched in Libya.
Yeah, there's no.
I mean, this is not a new thing.
There's no authorization for use of military force here that applies. Now, General Mattis came out with some sort of what I thought was a lame sort of explanation of, well, it's sort of related to this and that, and I don't think it washes. And to me, this is just another example of Congress abrogating its responsibility to take the lead on this. And no one wants to be seen as not being willing to stand up for chemical weapons use. But this is where this is what the framers intended is. They didn't want a situation where one person could, essentially commit our forces to an attack in another country. Now, it's different when it's responding to an imminent threat, certainly. And Mattis, I think, made some suggestion. Well, chemical weapons are a threat, and blah blah blah. But
there's not. I think that's not a a frivolous argument.
But it's not frivolous.
To
But
my mind,
yeah,
I'm saying I'm not saying necessarily it's a winning argument, but I don't think it's
yeah. But it's
it's not nothing. Yeah.
Right. I think it goes against pretty clearly what the Constitution and what the framers intended on this, and certainly it shouldn't have been difficult to have a debate in Congress on this and get an authorization for use of military force in this very limited thing. And I think it would be good going forward to say, I could see crafting one saying that Congress giving the president authority to launch limited strikes on Syrian chemical weapons infrastructure and so forth. And I think that would give this a lot more legitimacy, and it would encourage the sort of debate on the use of our force overseas in a way that I think is very healthy in a democracy.
No, I agree with you on that, actually. Although given the time frame, I think that might be a little difficult too in terms of. Although I mean that was like a week or so, but I think it's appropriate that Congress essentially has some skin in the game, if you will. And there's also there's a funny distinction. And it's not a constitutional distinction. It's just something that, as a matter of practice, we sort of come to accept things like airstrikes, drone strikes, things that are not committing troops to the ground, as being within presidential purview to do whatever, as opposed to committing actual ground forces. I'm not saying that it's right or wrong. I'm just saying it's a distinction that sort of is out there.
Yeah. And I think certainly Congress going forward there's nothing that would prevent Congress from putting together an authorization for subsequent, any necessary subsequent strikes.
Creating no-fly zones and that sort of thing that have been done before, yeah.
Especially given it seems like our policy is, and I think it's a good policy, to respond to any use of chemical weapons with some sort of display of force designed to degrade or eliminate that capability. So I think this would be entirely appropriate, and I am calling on Congress to do that. I don't think they will, and there are enough reasons to be disappointed in Congress, but this is just one more. All right, moving on. I thought this would originally be our top story, but our second story, House Speaker Paul Ryan dropped a bombshell this week when he announced that he would not seek re-election so that he can spend more time with his family. This has been a not very well kept secret for a while now that Ryan, who had practically been dragged kicking and screaming to the speakership from his post as Ways and Means Chair in 2015. I mean, he was looking to call it quits, but the assumption was that he'd stay on until after 2018 so he could use his fairly considerable fundraising clout to help the Republicans try to retain control of the House. And Ryan's retirement is the latest and without a doubt the highest profile of an unusually large number of Republican retirements. Right now, I believe it's 27 House Republicans have either announced their retirement or have resigned from office at this point, compared to only 11 Democrats. So, Jay, what do you make of Ryan's retirement?
Well, it saddens me, actually, a great deal. Paul Ryan, in many ways, represented the wing of the party that I sort of grew up with and support. That being the idea of the, Jack Kemp, tax cutting, prosperity raising Republicans.
The nice Republicans.
I'm just saying put that because again, I know there are plenty of people who have been critical and who people I also consider nice Republicans. Good Republicans that have been critical in terms of Ryan maybe not being strong enough on some issues, and I get that. I mean, to me that comes down more to tactics as opposed to ultimate ideology of where do you want to go. It's just more a question of how do you get there. But look, I think Paul Ryan, and I've never met the man, but by all reports, he is a good and decent human being, and I think his record shows that he's done his best to be a strong voice for republicanism, for conservatism, but at the same time he's not someone who is He was described, I read somewhere, as again, like a happy warrior, which is, sort of a Reagan-esque sort of term that, he reached out to work with people where he could, but he was not going to cave on principles. He was willing to cave on tactics occasionally, and understood maybe what was possible and what was not possible. But I'm going to miss him. The other piece that this was overlooked a couple years ago. He had a lot of proposals that were anti-poverty proposals about how do we create jobs, create prosperity, and that's again the Republican Party that I grew up with and the Republican Party that I sort of signed on for. So I mean there was one, and I believe it was the Wall Street Journal that could have been National Review, saying, listen, if we're now at the point that Paul Ryan is non-representative of the Republican Party, that just shows sort of the state that we are in.
Yeah, and there have been, a spate of articles about that. Politico had an article, "The Tragedy of Paul Ryan." Vox had an article, "Trump has won the fight over the Republican soul," that sort of thing. And you mentioned the response on the right. The narrative on the left about Paul Ryan has been very different for a while. I think it's overblown, to say the least. And that narrative is essentially that, in a way, Paul Ryan is actually worse than someone like a Donald Trump because he cleverly hides
He looks like a nice guy.
He looks like a nice guy. He acts like he's a reasonable policy person, but that's just a cover for his deep hatred of the poor.
Yeah.
And to me, that's the sort of thing that just drives me absolutely nuts. And I posted a thing in the Facebook page about some hysterical article from Vox which is essentially this sort of thing. And it's just suggesting that, well, clearly if Paul Ryan wants to cut this program, it's because, he has it in for poor people, which I think is just he has some ideas about what government should do and the proper role and how best to help people that I think are fundamentally misguided. But, to make that jump from fundamentally misguided to, well, obviously he's evil, I think is just as ridiculous as those people on the far right who say, well, clearly liberals hate America. That to me, that kind of thing is always driven me nuts. And of course, to put my cards on the table here, I grew up as sort of a Jack Kemp Republican type of person, Jack Kemp, Bob Dole, that sort of thing. And so Paul Ryan is sort of in that tradition. And I agree with both the voices on the left and the right who say that it's really sad that those sort of policy-oriented folks who don't traffic in the kind of white identity politics sort of thing don't seem to be getting a whole lot of traction today in the Republican Party. And I think it's much healthier if there are more Republicans like Paul Ryan and we hash out policy differences as opposed to playing this sort of, inflamed rhetoric, identity politics sort of thing that Ryan was never good at. And, a lot of people say, well, Ryan was a horrible person because he went along with Donald Trump. And yeah, I understand that argument. But also, I think Paul Ryan did the calculation and said, listen, I want to get tax reform through. I want to try to do what I can to make good things happen in the environment that has been created. And so, sure, when Donald Trump was a candidate, he was very anti-Trump. Then he was the president. It's like, oh, well, we got to work with the guy. And people,
what are you going to do?
Yeah. And is that hypocrisy?
And I would say, again, I've said for a while, the tax reform piece is not necessarily a Trump piece. That I think that's a piece of legislation that you would have gotten from any Republican president.
Yeah, I agree.
So that's not a particularly Trump thing. And going back though, I mean, the left does have a thing of always saying that the Republicans hate. I'm trying to think back to, who was it in '96 where they had the ads of them pushing grandma off the cliff in the wheelchair. Over the issue at that point was, would Medicare grow by, essentially restricting the percentage of growth of Medicare, which would still be growing. So I mean that's sort of.
And the right does the same thing. Like I said, the liberals hate America. Well, no, it's not supposed. But another thing I wanted to talk about in terms of Paul Ryan is it's interesting because he's the sort of I mean, he's been in Congress for 2 decades now, but he's only 48. And so he's a career politician, obviously. And he's the sort of person that sort of the new type of Republicans have taken over, those sort of, have a career in business, then go into Congress, kind of the sort of folks you associate with the Tea Party, kind of the antithesis of that sort of thing. So he's not their sort of person from background, from the way he approaches things and so forth. Yeah, temperament, all that kind of stuff. And one final point I want to make on that is, a lot of folks are talking about what's going to happen in 2018. And, I have to say, you take a look at the retirements and compare the Democrats and the Republicans. There's a reason why we're seeing this, certainly. And you would think that the people who would have the best sense of the lay of the land would be the people who are actually serving in Congress. And the fact that, like I said, 27 House Republicans are out now and only 11 Democrats, that says a lot about what the people who are probably most in the know think what's going to happen come November.
Yes and no. Although I will throw out an alternative hypothesis on that. And that is, and this is, I think, goes to differences in sort of just the Republican and Democratic psyches. Republicans typically, and this is not true of all, but they don't view government as the end all be all, and this is what they have to do and where they have to be.
Paul Ryan accepted.
Well, no, I'm saying that there are a lot of Republicans who, on the one hand, all right, a member of Congress, I think, makes what, $150,000, $130,000, something like that.
A little more than that. I think it's 170 something, but still, okay. A lot of these folks could make a lot more in the private sector.
Right, exactly. That's my point. Is that sounds like a lot of money, but actually, it's less than you think when you consider it all you have to do, and if you figure out the hours worked for that money. And the fact that you're likely to get almost get fired every 2 years, so I think there are plenty of people who have a lot of skills, could do a lot of things, and especially in this environment when they're sort of dealing with Trump on one side, the Tea Party on another, Democrats on another. I can understand the temptation of saying, forget this. I'm gonna go get a regular job or an irregular job, and live my life. Because I think that's something a lot of Republicans make that choice. I don't think Democrats tend to just because there's the sense of, hey, if I'm not in the government, well, that's okay. I don't have to be. So
well, yeah, I think there's some truth to that, though. I think also part of the calculus, and we see this with Democrats too, when there are signs of a Republican wave election, that they say, well, do I want to be in the majority or in the minority? And it's a whole lot less fun to be in the minority, at least if you want to get something done. And so we've seen this throughout congressional history, where when the signs point toward one party taking control, a lot of folks in the other party say, I don't want to be in the minority. So I think I'll just go and do something else. And
it's better to find a new job while you have a job.
Exactly.
So, I'm not discounting that, but yeah.
All right, well, moving on, another big story this week is Facebook co-founder and CEO Mark Zuckerberg. Well, he was on the hot seat testifying on 2 days for over 9 hours total before both the House and the Senate. Now, he started with the Senate, where he answered questions from both the Commerce and Judiciary committees, and then a day later he moved on to the House, where he testified before the Energy and Commerce Committee. Now, Zuckerberg, he brought in a bunch of experts to prep him for the congressional grilling. I'd say he did everything in the abject apology before Congress playbook. I mean, he repeatedly apologized. He took full responsibility. He looked and acted suitably contrite most of the time. He wasn't overly defensive or combative, and he promised to make amends. But to me, this was largely political theater that doesn't mean a whole lot, and I'll explain why. There's no legislation that's going to come out of this, at least not until mid-2019 at the very earliest, and everyone knows that. What I think is far more important than all these demonstrations of deep concern from senators and representatives that we saw during these hearings is the EU's more much more stringent internet privacy regulations, which go into effect on May 25th. And okay, they don't apply to the U.S. Zuckerberg gave us sort of a promise that Facebook would implement EU regulations for U.S. users, though he left himself enough wiggle room to get out of that if need be. But what's more important, at least I think, than his promise is the fact that because the EU is so large and the EU rules also apply to any data processing entities that are located in the EU, and Facebook has a huge one in Ireland, it might actually be difficult for them to have one set of rules for the US and another for the European Union, though we'll find out about that. So, Jay, what did you take away from Zuckerberg's testimony?
Oh, I think I agree with you pretty much on most parts. It was just sort of the standard show. I don't think it changes anything. I think Zuckerberg I think did fine. I think he probably helped his profile. But I don't think a lot comes out of this. And I'm still and people will. You can call me sort of a caveman here on this, but I'm still not seeing as much of the threat that again. To me, this whole thing seems to be fairly exaggerated. That this is stuff that Facebook has been doing for years, but the problem is that now Trump used it again when Facebook was using an app which was exploiting the same data for the Obama campaign. It was brilliant campaigning by the Democrats. My sense is, had Hillary Clinton won this election, Mark Zuckerberg would not have been appearing before Congress. But regardless, I don't know.
I don't think...
We've had this discussion before. I am not, in terms of Facebook trying to sell me stuff and or influence me. I just don't think it works that well.
Well, I disagree with you in part. I think that the issue really isn't so much whether, it's Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton. I think the issue is that
I understand it's the authorization, it's your data, and
I meant the fact that a hostile foreign power was attempting to use this platform to influence an election, and I don't care if they used it to influence the election toward my candidate or not. And there are both plenty of Republicans, Democrats and Republicans, who are concerned about that, and rightly so, I'd say. But to me, I guess again, I'm going to go back to that though. Look, that if these ads, that if we're talking just about the Russian Facebook ads, 50% of which ran after the election, and none of them had anything to say about elect or not elect one person or another. And had they been put out there by some American, would have been perfectly legitimate, perfectly protected by free speech, and to all accounts had really no effect on the election. So I mean, to me, that's sort of like what's But let me look at it this way. Just because I think there are two issues here. Number one is the issue of a hostile foreign power trying to use the social media, particularly Facebook, to influence an election. The second question is, how effective was that? And I would certainly agree with you that I don't think it had overall much of an impact. But that said, certainly we want to do what we can to make sure that actors like Russia aren't able to use these platforms to set up fake accounts to try to influence our elections in a way that's not okay. What
if they were to send a mailing? What's the difference?
You mean, well, I think the difference is that we don't know where those mailings were coming from. So if it said, hey, this is a mailing from Russia, and we're telling you that so I think that's the big part of it, is that I think a lot of people, if they'd see these messages saying, oh, by the way, this is from, Vladimir Putin from Moscow, hey, I'd like you to vote for, Donald Trump or something like that. That's different than creating a fake organization, literally fake news, to try to influence something. So I think that is the real issue here. Now, to me, though, that is less of a concern, though it's certainly a concern. The greater concern to me, and I think a number of members of Congress recognize this in their questions, maybe a minority, I don't know, is that loss of privacy is kind of baked into Facebook's business model. I mean, that's what they do. And there were a couple questions kind of got at to that. And basically what all Zuckerberg could say is, well, this is how we make money, and I think last week on the show, Trey and Ken had a great discussion on this. And essentially, people are willing to give up their privacy for this network. And I think, though, Ken made some good arguments, and a number of other people have, is that people don't necessarily understand the information that's being used and how it's used and how much Facebook knows about them and so forth. They might feel differently if they knew that, basically. And I think there's something to that. If you take a look at these agreements, we've all clicked on a whole bunch of these agreements, and they're, pages and pages of, I'd hate to say legal gobbledygook, but essentially they're, these things where people don't really know what they're entering into. There's the question of what's called informed consent as opposed to just consent, basically. And I don't think that's going to change because, of course, the value that we have for Facebook is all the information they can, hoover up about us, basically. And that's, that's why we're valuable to them. And they're not going to want to change that business model because they can't make money any other way. So that's not going to change. And that, to me, is the longer term, more serious threat. And, I think I might have said this before, maybe it's because I grew up in a generation where privacy was still sort of a thing. And maybe for younger folks, that sort of expectation of privacy isn't such a big deal. I don't know. But to me, it's a little troubling. But that said, of course, I'm on Facebook every single day. So I guess I'm willing to make that trade-off too.
Yeah. See, I've cut down my Facebook use dramatically, not relation to privacy or Russians or anything like that. I don't know, just not into it that much anymore. So I mean, maybe it's maybe I have a sort of a strange immunity to this, but I get the idea that this is. I guess maybe I've always understood that that's what they're selling is my data. And if I get ads that are maybe more targeted to me, more than random ads that I might see in a newspaper, well, okay. But again, it's still it's not mind control. And advertisers have been doing that for forever. The other piece I think is interesting, and again, I'm a little bit of a techno skeptic on some of these things. A good friend of mine was telling me there's a program you can look up, I guess what Facebook thinks of your partisan identity. And she is a pretty conservative Republican, not necessarily activist Republican or anything like that, but I think has voted the Republican ticket for forever. And Facebook had her pegged as being a liberal Democrat. So, I mean, I'm again, that's just obviously one small example. Maybe they get it right on a whole lot of these other things. But I think sometimes these algorithms and all that as much as we make of this, that they can figure all this stuff out, they're not always that good. Now that's not to say they're not going to get better in the future. But
well, this kind of gets in. It's just a little off subject, but what the heck? We can talk about this a little bit. This gets into why, weirdly enough, I'm not a libertarian, because it seems to me the sort of argument that you're making is one that I hear a lot of libertarians make. Is that, well, people aren't going to be affected by this and so forth because I'm not and my friends aren't, and I always think, well, yeah, but you are in the top, 5, maybe 1% in terms of your understanding of how media works.
Half percent, probably.
Yeah, maybe even that. And so I think, and that to me is the real issue. Is so it's important that we don't make our judgments about what's appropriate and not based on what we and people who see the world and have the advantages in education.
Super informed
okay, you said it.
No,
I didn't.
I mean, I get that, and I thank you. I appreciate that you think that highly of me. But I think people have more common sense than you give them credit for on
Yeah,
something
well,
like
and
this.
that's kind of that fundamental argument is that the people, left to their own will make these right decisions. And I've just read.
Exactly. That comes right down to it, doesn't it? That's why I believe in freedom, and you believe that the people must be controlled for their
I
own
guess,
good.
well, I guess I've read too much in terms of how systematic biases work and manipulation and a lot of the research in cognitive psychology and behavioral economics. And so I just can't be as kind of cavalier about it. I would like to have that view, but based on the evidence that I've seen, I just can't. So. All right. Before we get to our next story, we'd like to thank our newest supporter, Sean, who's our newest sustaining monthly supporter on Patreon. So
Thank you, Sean.
thank you, Sean. We really do appreciate your generous support of the show. And I want to say, it's been a crazy spring semester for me for a lot of reasons. I took on some new classes, decided I would completely redo them, and that was really dumb of me. But the semester is coming to a close for me. I'm hoping over the summer to have the time to figure out a way to show our appreciation to supporters, aside from these shout outs, which of course we'll continue to do. So if you have any thoughts or ideas, about what you'd like, whether you're a current financial supporter or a potential one, please let us know. You can reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. And when you do make a pledge of financial support for the show, we would love to include a message from you in our shout out. So if there's anything you'd like us to pass along, let us know. You can do that through Patreon or PayPal, or just send us an email, again, mail@politicsguys.com, and send us your message there. So Sean, if there's anything you'd like us to pass along, just drop us a line this week and we will include it next week. And of course, listener support is what makes this show possible. So if you'd like to join Sean and all of our other great Politics Guys supporters, just go to politicsguys.com/support, or just go to politicsguys.com and you can see the support thing there on the site. Thanks a lot. All right, moving on. Early this week, FBI agents raided the Manhattan office of President Trump's longtime attorney and fixer, Michael Cohen, who's reportedly under investigation for bank fraud, wire fraud, and campaign finance law violation related to the 2016 payment Cohen made to porn star Stormy Daniels in exchange for her silence concerning a sexual relationship that she said she had with Trump in 2006. Now, my understanding of the law here is that Cohen could legally have essentially bought off Daniels if his intent was simply to, say, protect the reputation of Donald Trump, or to prevent his wife, Trump's wife, that is, from finding out about the affair, because I'm sure that, she doesn't know that her husband has affairs. Another story. Anyway, but it only becomes a crime if he made the payment in an attempt to influence the election. And I'm guessing that intent may be difficult to prove, unless, of course, there's some communication between Cohen and Trump to that effect. And it said that actually one of the things that was taken was audio recording. So, Jay, you're our resident attorney. How big of a deal is an FBI raid that seizes attorney-client communications?
It's a very big deal, actually, and I think this is really troubling on a lot of levels. Now, again, I can't speak to the bank fraud or the wire fraud claims or those rationales, because I gotta tell you, I don't really understand exactly what it is that they're accusing him of. On the campaign finance piece of it, again, this is something that no one has ever been convicted of. This idea of the paying off a third party. One third party paying off another third party amounts to a in-kind contribution, essentially unreported in-kind contribution to a campaign. John Edwards was essentially charged with this and was not convicted. So I think when you've got a thing of you're looking to prosecute a crime which has never been prosecuted before, which may or may not even be a crime, there ought to be a really high bar to break into the attorney-client privilege. I'm not saying that there could never be cases when you can't have a raid that would seize attorney-client materials. The attorney-client privilege does not cover fraud. It does not cover preparation to engage in criminal conduct and so forth. So there are exceptions. But this strikes me very much as an overreach, when the initial thing to do could have been to send a subpoena at which point Cohen would have resisted the subpoena, and you go to court and you sort out what's privileged, what's not, and what documents have to be turned over.
Now, in that case, I would think that maybe the concern would be that documents would be destroyed or made unavailable. And it seems to me also, again, correct me if I'm wrong here, that this is not the sort of thing that you get authorization for just on a whim. In other words, it's not like the FBI said, "Hey, do you mind if we go ahead and raid this attorney-client communications?" And the Justice Department said, because this went all the way up to the top, essentially say, "Oh yeah, that's fine, sure." I mean, there had to be some sort of good reason given, presumably, before this authorization was given to go ahead and do this. One would think, and I also
one would think, and again, that's what concerns me is I wasn't in the court when they went in to get the warrant, so I'm concerned. And look, this is something that my concern is in the legal system. There seems to be perhaps a double standard for Americans and Americans named Donald Trump. It's sort of like if we need to get a warrant on someone because of this, and I think in most cases there is a healthy skepticism if we need to get a warrant and it relates to Donald. But granted, I mean that's.
But you don't know that. I mean, you're making.
I don't.
Okay, I just want to be clear on that.
All I can say is, this type of thing is extraordinary. And ought to require an extraordinary showing.
Yeah, and I guess
here's the thing: if I were the magistrate judge, who granted this, my questions would have been, all right, why can't you just subpoena this? And they would have to say, well, we're concerned that they'll destroy it. Okay, what evidence do you have that they'll destroy it? What protections can you get to prevent against that destruction? For example, you can say, we want to, you can do what's called imaging the hard drive, and you can protect that, and you get that to the court, and then they can sort through what's going on. You can tell if files have been erased. What I'm saying is, I think there are a lot of other procedural ways it could have been done that could have preserved attorney-client safeguards, could have gotten the Justice Department the information it's looking for. But they chose the drama.
Well, but again, and let me be clear on this. You are making an assumption based on what you do not know. In other words, they could have these questions presumably
they all could have been asked, and they all could have said, yes, we have really good reason to believe he's going to destroy this evidence, and we got to grab it right away.
There are two narratives here, and both of them are based on complete speculation. The one narrative is, well, like you said, there's one standard for Donald Trump and another standard for everyone else. In other words, key figures in the Justice Department and the FBI are out to get the president. That's one narrative. The other narrative is, well, there's some very good reason why they are pursuing this, and everything has been done on the up and up. And so part of this, I think, is to what extent do you believe that the Justice Department and FBI are, staffed with people at the top levels who have integrity? And certainly Donald Trump and his supporters have good reason to push back against that integrity in the Justice Department and FBI narrative. And I would say that I would argue that we have even better reason to push back against the integrity of the president narrative. But
fair enough. I'll tell you where I'm coming from. And this is, I had the opportunity I was at a conference a couple years ago, the Sixth Circuit Judicial Conference, where I heard they had a panel on the Ted Stevens prosecution. And they had the judge from the Ted Stevens
former Senator,
case.
Alaska. Yeah.
And this was a judge who was a Clinton appointee. And this is where the Department of Justice was essentially found in contempt for failing to turn over exculpatory materials, and that they lied to the court about this. And this, I'll tell you, the book, and I apologize, I forget the author. It's absolutely chilling. And in this panel discussion, we had members of the Justice Department and the judge saying how absolutely ridiculous this happened. And the Justice Department said, yeah, these things happen, and they'll probably happen again. And I think this is, in that case, it wasn't just even a few bad apples. It was institutional, that this was a political prosecution. And so the regular rules didn't apply. And I think there's, again, maybe I'm sounding sort of overly libertarian. I'm not saying that Trump hasn't done plenty of shady things. But however, whatever shady things he does, that's sort of aside from the point of the civil protections that you're due under the Constitution.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's an important point to make. And so to me, again, it is somewhat overly simplistic to say, who do you trust, the Justice Department or President Trump? And I think you make a good point about protections, needing
I'm
to
not
apply.
saying, I think my point is I don't trust either, really.
Well, see, that's where you and I part
important
ways.
to have a hedge against the Justice Department than against Donald Trump.
That's where you and I part ways a little bit. And also I think we should talk about a story that hit just after we finished prepping this week's show, which is at least somewhat related to this. Oh, before we do that, though, I wanted to mention, though, a lot of people are kind of, including the president, are sort of conflating the Cohen raid and the Mueller investigation. They're two separate things. This is being handled by, and so just wanted to point that out. But
although the evidence showed that this was the information which was used by the AUSA to get the warrant, was provided by Mueller to them.
Right. He passed it along, basically, and then they handled it separately. So I also want to point out, though, this is sort of related story, is the Department of Justice's Inspector General released a report concluding that former FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe lied to investigators about his role in leaking a story to the Wall Street Journal about the Hillary Clinton investigation, including lying to former Director James Comey, who's in the news this week because of his new book. Now, the president's tweet response to this is worth reading. DOJ just issued the McCabe report, which is a total disaster. He lied. McCabe was totally controlled by Comey. McCabe is Comey. No collusion, all made up by this den of thieves and lowlifes, which, okay, in light of what's in the actual report, doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
No, it doesn't. Yeah, but actually, the president could have done. Again, if I'm putting on my purely Machiavellian hat, he could have done a lot more damage with a much better tweet.
Exactly.
Saying that, look, according to the report, either McCabe's lying or Comey's lying.
That would have made more sense.
FBI broken. You know what I mean? That kind of thing.
Yeah. But I think that was just obviously a clearly emotional tweet that doesn't make a lot of sense. No, but what it does do is it sort of upends a narrative of at least some on the left that McCabe was sort of unfairly railroaded out of the FBI by a president who was determined to destroy the leadership of the agency. Now, I believe certainly that the president is determined to destroy the leadership of the agency, but the McCabe thing, it seems pretty, I mean, his attorney, of course, is saying that this is unfair and they disagree with the conclusions of the report and that sort of thing. But this idea that this proves that McCabe and Comey were part of this, cabal trying to destroy the president. Maybe there were two separate cabals. Maybe you could make that argument, right. if you're.
Well, yeah. If anybody, if anything, I mean, if what the report tells us, it would appear that if McCabe is a victim, if he is not to be believed, then it's Comey who threw him under the bus.
Yeah, but and the IG seems to say that isn't really how it worked out.
And the IG says that Comey appears to be more credible for a whole number of reasons on these issues. But actually, I mean, I think the report's actually kind of fascinating and worth reading. And someone posted it to our Facebook page. So check it out. It's fun reading. It's horribly confusing too. I think that there's a lot going on.
Well, and there's this whole culture, and a lot of people may not realize this whole culture of leaks and how leaking works and strategic leaking, and everyone does it, and it only becomes an issue when you're sort of caught doing it. I mean, there are authorized leaks, there are sort of wink authorized leaks, and runs the whole gamut. This is how government works for a lot of reasons.
The gist of this, of course, came down to McCabe's story was Comey okayed me to leak this, or to tell the special counsel to leak this. And Comey says, no, I didn't. And then, McCabe's. And so that's regardless. I think you read the report. I think McCabe comes out as having changed his story a number of times.
But of course, the president saying McCabe is totally controlled by Comey. That's exactly what the report says.
It's like he didn't read the report. Yeah,
there's a shock. Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, it is time for What We're Reading, where we step back from all this crazy stuff that's happening in the news cycle and talk about those more in-depth, thoughtful things that we're reading or sometimes listening to or watching. Do you want to start us off today, Jay?
I am, and it's going to be something kind of goofy and really non-political. Um, just because sometimes I'm a big believer. As you know, I'm a student of American literature. So I've always
Absolutely.
been trying to get the look for, like, again, the soul of America
Jay's
as
a
it comes.
Renaissance
So
man. He really
I am,
is.
I am. But so what I've been reading lately are short stories of Damon Runyon.
Ooh, I like
Um,
him.
yeah, and again, Damon Runyon wrote again early part of the 20th century, and it's all these stories of Broadway in New York in the 20s and 30s, and it is the musical Guys and Dolls is based on Damon Runyon stories, and it's all these sort of shady characters who are also comical, but the writing style is really just fun.
Oh yeah.
And if you read it, here's the thing. This is what hit me that I hadn't really occurred to me before. It's very Trumpian.
Hmm.
There is the way Runyon writes. It's very much in the Trumpian rhythm. And I think again this is this New York kind of thing, where it's you start off with a story and then you have this sort of break into these funny asides of this. Again, happy to be here in Pennsylvania, where I own many beautiful properties, and this sort of, and there's this sort of again tough guy gangster-esque kind of language to it that really is reminiscent of Trump. And the other thing that is reminiscent of Trump with Runyon is everybody has a nickname.
Right. That's right. Yes. Yes.
Everybody is sort of this, whatever, Bookie Joe, Fast Eddie, Shorty, and again, I'm not saying that Trump necessarily reads this or modeled himself after it, but again, I think it's just interesting. This is one of those things that's sort of in the water, if you will, of American literature and language, and it sort of shows up here. I mean, not really 100 years, but almost 100 years after that was written.
Interesting. Yeah. That's weird. I am a huge fan of Damon Runyon. I've read his short stories and Guys and Dolls. I actually have seen it on Broadway twice. There was a revival in the '90s, and then one.
You wouldn't think of that, would you? That you're a big Broadway guy.
Oh, I'm not really, but I love Guys and Dolls. Like I said, I got to see it in the '90s revival. I was actually very disappointed because at that point, the lead role was played by I was going to say Nathan Detroit, but Nathan Lane actually was playing the lead role. And then right before, like a week or so before I went to see it in New York, it was changed, and the lead role he ended up being replaced by Jamie Farr. It was very disappointing. But then I got to see it in London, and it was amazing. Got to sit in the front row, and it was astonishingly good. And then I saw another revival of it on Broadway later on. So I'm a huge fan. Great stuff, and that's a great recommendation. So my recommendation for this week. Recently, Sam Harris and Ezra Klein did a podcast. It was the most fascinating and frustrating couple of hours that I've spent with a podcast in a long time. They had this whole thing about Charles Murray. Basically, Harris had Murray on his podcast. We've talked about Murray before. Right. Essentially, I'm
a big fan of Charles Murray.
Yeah, I know you are. And basically, Sam Harris said in his podcast with Murray, which he called Forbidden Knowledge, it's very worth checking out, that he said, well, I always had this idea of Charles Murray, that he was this evil, kind of racist guy. And I stayed away from him and association with him. And then I decided I'd actually read the bell curve. And he said, well, based on that, I all of a sudden had a whole different view of Charles Murray, and I wanted him on the show. I feel he's been unfairly maligned. There was the whole thing about Middlebury College, where I got, basically pushed off the stage and that sort of thing, and people being assaulted and that sort of thing. And it was really fascinating because Ezra Klein and Vox responded by saying Sam Harris is essentially supporting this racist guy, basically. And they went back and forth, and it got very, very snippy and so forth. And it was a fascinating discussion. And Harris's, I think, really important point is that conservatives can have legitimate policy disagreements with liberals without conservatives being unsympathetic or downright evil. We talked about this with the Paul Ryan thing, and that's the sort of thing that just drives me nuts. It was sort of that's what Harris was. Sorry, that's what Klein was pointing out, saying, well, Murray is coming from a place of racial animus, and Harris was saying, well, okay, maybe he is and maybe he isn't, but the data is the data. And it's one thing to talk about who Charles Murray is as a person, and it's another thing to critique his data and his methods and his conclusion. And it was like Klein was not hearing that. And Harris's point was saying, well, so many people on the left seem to be willing to ignore good evidence and accept bad arguments for the sake of an ideological goals that they've decided are, lofty or important or morally good or something like that. And I thought that was dead on. I think Vox does that all the time. And much of my friends on the left sometimes do that. It's, not arguing in good faith and seriously considering new evidence. It drives me nuts, basically. It happens on the left and the right, but of course, most of the media, I listen to a lot of media on the right, but of course, when your side is being intellectually dishonest, it hurts even more because you want to hold your side to a higher standard. But, I also think that Klein made some good points about Harris. And sometimes Sam Harris just drives me nuts because he has this sort of, I am this above it all sort of objective scientist type of person. And I have access to a truth that you don't because I don't get sucked into your debates. And, and Klein's point was, well, we're all coming to this from a point of view and you need to recognize that. And it occurred to me that they both have these frames, that they're in. Ezra Klein sees himself as this sort of, I think, pragmatic, analytical, progressive, I don't know, it goes too far to call him a social justice warrior.
He thinks pretty highly of himself.
Yeah, certainly. And, and Harris sees himself as this passionate, scientific truth teller, that sort of thing. And what bothers me about both of them is that neither of them is particularly good at getting outside of those frames. And they talk past each other. Sam Harris does this all the time. So does Ezra Klein. Drives me nuts. Listen to Harris's interview with Jordan Peterson for a great example of this, or many of the religious folks that Sam Harris has interviewed. And it occurred to me that, that we all do this. I think you and I maybe even do this. I mean, a big part of my identity here is a reasonable bipartisan with a contrarian streak. And I think because that's my identity, and because that's why we started the show in part, is I tend to look for points of agreement, and occasionally I look for ways that I might kind of break off from my party's orthodoxy and things. And that definitely influences how I see the world. And, I also think it part comes from the fact that I started off on the right and now I'm on the center left. And I'm guessing, Jay, you probably have an identity along those lines too that influences how you see these things.
Yeah, I think so. And again, I come from the, my ideal of conservative thought was sort of, William F. Buckley and sort of that George Will school that, again, the willingness to debate in good faith, engage intellectually, not saying you give up your side, but you argue in good faith and make a good attempt to understand where the other side's coming from and address their arguments on the merits where they are.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. What frustrates
me,
and
not just say he's a racist.
Exactly. Well, and what frustrates me for so much of this on the left and the right is that there are these sort of faux discussions where they're not about getting at the truth. They're not about actually listening and considering these points. They're, okay, I am going to this to win this argument. And that's much more important than finding out what the truth or, approaching the truth. And I think so many of these people, especially these very smart people who, of course, think very highly of themselves, as both Klein and Harris do, is they are so loath to concede a point. And that's not even, I think it's so difficult for them to even contemplate that they do end up talking past each other. And it's something that it has nothing to do with intelligence. I think it's just this idea that, well, the important thing here is winning the argument for my side. And that I don't think should be the important thing. And I'd like to think that you and I try to push back against that. And we do try to listen to each other and sort of, see where the other side might have a reasonable point.
Yeah. Well, I think it's maybe less about intelligence, more just hubris.
Yeah.
So,
kind of having a sort of humility. Maybe that's easier to do if you're kind of Midwestern folks who didn't graduate from Harvard.
Two jokers doing a Saturday morning podcast than if you're Ezra Klein.
Seriously. I mean, I think there's that whole, and this is part of that obviously conservative critique against, the so-called coastal elites and so forth. But these people who, think that they have some, privileged access to the truth, whether they're people on the left or the right who don't really have the experience of going to, good but not great schools and not being raised in kind of that 1% sort of bubble, if you will. And I do think that gives them a sort of a skewed view on both the right and the left of what's really going on. And so I'm practically going to have to undislocate my shoulder from patting ourselves on the back here. But I think at least when we're at our best, that's what we can, at least try to provide. An antidote to that. So, yay for us. Okay.
Yay for us.
All right.
And people should go read the bell curve and Coming Apart and make their own conclusions.
Absolutely. All right. Well, that's it for this episode. Thanks everyone for listening. We hope you liked what you heard. Listener support is what keeps the show going. We truly appreciate it. So if you'd like to help us out, go to politicsguys.com/support. That's a direct link, or you can just go to politicsguys.com and go to support in the main menu, or just click on those Patreon or PayPal links that you'll see there. Subscribing to the show also really helps us, as does sharing episodes. So it'd be great if you could do that. It's easy to do. Just hitting that little triangle thingy, share, whatever. Because word of mouth is really the best advertising. Also, leaving reviews and ratings on iTunes really does help. If you want to get in touch with us, you know how to reach us. It's mail@politicsguys.com. There's our Facebook page where you can message us and where there are some really great discussions, I think, throughout the week. And so if you've already given up your privacy and bought into the Facebook thing, as I have, it's facebook.com/politicsguys page. We're also on Twitter @politicsguys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Trey Orndorff, and Bruce Johnson. Today's show was produced by Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Wednesday. We hope you'll join us.